The next video. Today I was watching Panda Bearme's stream and he was talking about how he really liked 2-base Muta and he thought it was Muta play was underrated or was stronger than people were giving it credit for, and that especially 2-base Muta was the best version. But I sort of thought this was interesting more from the approach of 3-base Muta and or any Muta gameplay variants in Zerg vs Zerg. I'm not sure if I mentioned that yet. So in Zerg vs Zerg, the most common way you see people play is you have people go up to that 66 drones pretty defensively, pretty safely, going Roach Ravager. They might get Burrow move, but they're going into Lurkers and Hives slowly, getting the Lurker upgrades, going into Vipers, and then playing a very big late game scenario while with lots of multi-prong. And it's an interesting way to play. And I find it enjoyable to watch, especially, I think. But if one player doesn't want to engage with it, so what I mean by that is often you'll see both players posturing and aggressively counterattacking, and the games will often end. But you can play in a way where you just sit there on Lurkers and Vipers, and it might not be the optimal way to play, but you can make it very hard for your opponent to make anything happen. And if you're an aggressively minded player who wants to push the pace in a game of StarCraft, this can be a really frustrating thing to happen. And you have to go into this super late game, Viper versus Viper, spores, lurkers, like bases everywhere. That can be really difficult, especially if they're a specialist in playing late game and you haven't practiced it very much. So enter the Mutas. The idea that I sort of have is that if you can go Mutas against Zerg, if you practice, like you can develop it to be safe against all ends. This was the key point that Panda Bearme was making on his stream, where he was saying that you can hold all the all ends and get to Mutas if you want to, whether that's with 2-base Mutas, which he was a fan of, or the melee into 3-base Muta that's common at the moment. So if you have that game plan prepared and you know how to defend all the all-ins and you can get to Mutas, then you can play a very aggressive play style with a lot of ability to force the pace, and your opponent is going to have to play super clean to fight against Mutas, because if at any point if you slip up against Mutas, you can end up so far behind, which is why when you watch a lot of these Muta games, you'll often see the Muta player getting a huge lead. It's only rare, I think, that the Muta player doesn't do as well, and it's usually because they got behind from the early game or something like this, right? Like, I don't usually see Mutas coming out and struggling necessarily, or the defensive player plays really, really good. And so the idea is that if you can go Mutas and you're playing against someone who you think has a strong late game Zerg vs Zerg play, who's very defensive, then you can bypass the late game. You can play Mutas, bypass that defensive late game, go into ultras and speed banes with lots of like attacking corner bases, pushing your advantage. Like you can play this really aggressive, take control of the game play style. Whereas if they play that way and you've got roaches, it's a lot harder. And this also gives you the advantage, right, of you avoid some other... So roach into Muta is actually quite hard to play. Because again, like I said, the temptation is always there for you to just commit and all in them. But it's usually not the right move. The disciplined thing to do, right, is to sit back, get spores, drone up, take another base, maybe pressure a little bit, run some roaches around the edge, and then commit to playing a really long game where you're defending the whole time, right? So for me, I don't want to defend as in StarCraft. Like, I want to push the pace. I want to push my will onto my opponent when I'm playing StarCraft. And I think if you're anything like that, then I think Mutas might be the solution, because the two scenarios where roaches get you into a defensive position are A, against Mutas, and B, against someone who turtles on lurkers, right? With Mutas, you can play aggressive. You must play aggressive into someone who turtles with lurkers. And 2, you must you avoid roach versus muta. That's the second point, right? So then the only added dynamic, right, is you can get into muta versus muta games, but those you can then transition out of, or you can find edges. And if you're like a specialist mutalisk player, like you play a lot of mutas, then you have a really, really good chance, I think, of winning out in muta versus muta wars, because you've practiced it more, you're more comfortable with the play style, and you can play with lings a lot more, and you can mix in a lot of different strategies. Now, I'm not saying that you should go at every game, but I think that this strategy is, people don't think about it in the correct way. I think it's an amazing way, and I think it's why we see Reynor play it so much, to allow yourself to get a uneven matchup in ZVZ, where you can have mutas against roaches, as opposed to even versus even, right? You can get some a dynamic feeling where like I'm strong in this area and you're strong in this area, and like how can we play around that? And I think it makes for interesting games. And I think being on the muta side of it is actually preferable, just from a enjoyment place. Like you get map control, you can play, whereas you're a zerg player, if that makes sense in that case, whereas you're more of like a Protoss player if you sit back and play against mutas. So I'm not a practiced Protoss player, right? And most Zerg players out there are not going to be practiced Protoss players, in the sense that they're building a strong army that has to be able to be slow and defend everywhere, right? I'm used to being the faster person. I'm used to being able to have map control and expand a lot. And so I think that you're actually naturally playing into what most likely will be your strengths as a player by opting into mutas. And for that reason, I think it's a really underrated and a very powerful play style and this was the thought that I was having today.